Victor Berlioz, 1830. The 26-year-old composer has just completed his musical studies and already has ambitious plans. He intends to take Paris audiences by storm. But the responses to his music are ambivalent. Some see him as an innovator of genius, others as an iconoclast, only out for effect.
Without doing Berlioz any injustice, I think we can say he was extremely extrovert, intent on making sure that the whole world knew exactly how he felt.
Dass alle Welt über seine Seelenzustände Bescheid wusste. Also die Musik drückt eigentlich.
His music constantly expresses what was going on in his mind, and he wanted everyone else to know about it, or ideally, to feel exactly the same way as he did.
So empfinden.
My life is a novel that intrigues me greatly.
What is perhaps the most important chapter of his novel provides the programmatic basis for the Symphonie Fantastique. More than any other of his works, it revolves around his own emotional world. He calls the symphony an episode in the life of an artist and announces its inception in a letter to his friend Ferrand.
I'm about to start work on my big symphony, in which I intend to describe the progress of my infernal passion. I have it all mapped out in my head.
The object of Berlioz's infernal passion was a young Irish actress. He had first seen Harriet Smithson in 1827 on stage as Ophelia in a performance of Shakespeare's Hamlet at the Théâtre l'Odéon in Paris. Berlioz was completely bowled over. Like many of his contemporaries, Berlioz was a fervent admirer of Shakespeare. He was fascinated by the way the English dramatist transcended traditional genre boundaries in his plays.
Berlioz war ein Shakespeare-Maniac, kann man sagen.
In fact, Berlioz was a genuine Shakespeare maniac. His admiration for him knew no bounds, and he transferred that adulation to Harriet Smithson as well. Apparently, she was not exactly the finest actress on the English stage at the time, but in Paris, she caused a sensation.
Zumindest hat sie Sensation gemacht.
Berlioz wanted to impress Harriet Smithson, and he wanted fame. He hoped that the first performance of the Symphonie Fantastique would achieve both these aims at once. To make the Parisians sit up and take notice, he even published the literary programme underlying his symphony in the renowned Revue Musicale.
As the work does without the assistance of the spoken word, the outline of this instrumental drama needs to be set out in advance. These program notes, therefore, fulfill the same function as the spoken text of an opera.
While working on the symphony, Berlioz realized that Harriet Smithson did not yet return his love. He withdrew disappointed, and in his literary program, he transformed his beloved into a witch.
Today we would say that this was an extremely successful marketing ploy, because nothing interests people more than gossip. The prospect of this young man bearing his soul to the Parisians in his symphony was definitely one of the reasons why tickets for the concert sold so well.
Berlioz was just embarking on his career as a composer. He was a great admirer of the novels of E.T.A. Hoffmann. Their ambivalent, fantastical narrative structures full of parallel worlds and supernatural elements found their way into the program and the title of the symphony. Berlioz's ambitions were almost equally fantastical. The first performance of the symphony took place in a concert devoted exclusively to his works.
Anyone else would have doubted whether this was a realistic proposition. But Berlioz obviously had such an outsized ego that it never occurred to him that this plan might run into trouble.
For his project, Berlioz managed to enlist the services of the renowned conductor François-Antoine Abenek. The first performance of the Symphonie Fantastique was the highlight of the concert that took place on the 5th of December 1830 at the Paris Conservatory. The response from the audience was rapturous. But the acclaim was by no means universal. Some critics balked at the liberties Berlioz had taken with the traditional symphonic form and were puzzled or disconcerted by his unconventional style.
In this symphony, it becomes very clear that the composer is striving first and foremost for unheard-of effects. Altogether, the music causes astonishment rather than enjoyment.
This verdict was soon overturned. Today the symphony stands as a milestone in the history of program music.
A young musician sees for the first time a woman who personifies all the enchantment of the ideal being dreamed up in his imagination, and falls desperately in love with her. The transition from a state of melancholy reverie to one of delirious passion is the subject of the first movement.
The first movement is made up of what we would traditionally call a slow introduction, followed by the main section in quick time. But if you weigh up the two sections against each other, you find that the 64 bars at the beginning cannot really qualify as a slow introduction, because they take just as long as the subsequent fast section.
The lengthy introduction is an expression of the protagonist's melancholy reveries. Rather than anticipating the musical events to come, it's an atmospheric reflection of the basic idea of the program. Only at the beginning of the second section, describing the protagonist's passions, do we encounter the main theme that recurs throughout the rest of the work. Like a recurring motif in an opera, this theme reappears at various points in the symphony, as if to illustrate an obsessive preoccupation with the unattainable beloved. Berlioz himself referred to the theme as an idée fixe.
This expression originates from psychiatry or psychology. An idée fixe is something you cannot shake off, something you cannot get rid of. In other words, this unrequited love has rooted itself in his mind, and he has no way of dealing with it.
In line with the program for the symphony, Berlioz does without a second theme. The idée fixe dominates the musical structure. It appears in all kinds of variations, and a number of different motifs are derived from it.
If we look at the orchestra Berlioz calls for, and compare it with, say, Beethoven's symphonies, which were still more or less the standard at the time, then we see that the scale is significantly bigger. Berlioz uses the same woodwinds, but now there are 4 bassoons, not just 2, as with the horns, 4 instead of 2.
verwendet nicht nur 2 Hörner, sondern 4 Hörner.
Berlioz, who was later to cause quite a stir with his famous treatise on instrumentation, takes his bearings from the forces typical of a contemporary opera orchestra. Compared with the traditional symphony orchestra, it was able to draw on a broader range of resources deployed for dramatic effect. final bars of the first movement are marked religiosamente. At this point, the written program speaks of religious consolations. In terms of tone painting, Berlioz cleverly achieves an effect of inner repose by using long note values and a cadence modelled on church music. Berlioz's great inspiration was Ludwig van Beethoven, and it was Beethoven who gave him the decisive impetus to combine the symphonic form with an extra musical program. The movements in Beethoven's Sixth Symphony, the Pastoral, all have programmatic titles, but unlike Berlioz's symphony, Beethoven's music conveys its full message without any program notes to refer to.
Bei Berlioz kehrt sich das eher um.
With Berlioz, the opposite is the case. Here we tend to assume that we have very little documentary evidence to go by, that the symphony and its program took shape more or less side by side. In any event, we can safely say that the symphony's intentions can hardly be fully appreciated without its program.
Berlioz divides his symphony into 5 sections instead of the usual 4. A form like that of Shakespeare's plays.
Die Fünfsätzigkeit ist nicht strukturell begründet, wie in
There is no structural reason for this. In fact, there is no purely structural reason for anything in this symphony.
aus dem Programm oder aus dem dramatischen Ablauf.
What matters is the program or the dramatic course of events.
Das ist
In fact, what we have here is what you might call an orchestral opera.
das Programm.
The program tells us what happens to the protagonist, and that protagonist is not a tenor who can inform us of what's going on in his mind. He is, as it were, embodied in individual instruments and individual situations.
Instrumenten und in einzelnen Situationen.
The young musician sees his beloved among all the glittering tumult of a fashionable ball.
Here again, it's the composer's program that prompts him to choose a lilting contemporary waltz for the dance movement of the symphony instead of a staid and courtly minuet.
And from the outset, he employs the instruments one would have expected to hear at a ball, particularly in France at the time. He adds 2 harps to the rest of the orchestra, makes sparing use of the brass, except for the horns, and relies mostly on the woodwinds, the gossamer sound of the strings, and of course those harp arpeggios at the beginning.
Streicher und am Anfang eben Harfenarpeggien.
This carefree waltz atmosphere doesn't last long. Suddenly the sound picture changes. The idée fixe returns, now in 3/4 time, on flutes and oboes.
Und dann verklingt langsam, dann verschwindet
Then the
langsam.
idée fixe slowly fades away, as if it were receding from view, and the waltz music reasserts itself.
Bei der Symphonie Fantastique kommt man immer...
The Symphonie Fantastique is full of situations that are reminiscent of a film. We imagine the beloved disappearing into another room. The protagonist tries to catch up with her, but his attempts are foiled. There are too many people in the way for him to get close to her.
One summer evening, The young musician hears two peasants playing their pipes to call the cows home.
Here, everything is at peace. The shepherds sit with their flocks and play tunes on their pipes. These exchanges are scored for cor anglais and oboe, the instruments traditionally used to evoke a pastoral setting. They respond to one another from a distance. This is an entirely different world, not the tumult and confusion of city life, nor the complications of a social event like the ball we have just left. The tranquility of the rural setting may perhaps restore the young musician's peace of mind.
Once again, Berlioz employs a device borrowed from the theatre. He indicates that the oboe's responses to the cor anglais should come from derrière la scène, offstage, thus achieving an entirely novel evocation of space unprecedented in the symphonic literature of the time. Somewhat later in the third movement, the idée fixe turns up again on flutes and oboes. But this time, it's deliberately set against the 6/8 rhythm. The program notes comment on the passage.
She reappears once again. He feels a pang of anguish. Distressing premonitions assail him.
So even in the tranquility of this rural setting, the protagonist is unable to rid himself of his idée fixe. In fact, it claims more and more of the orchestral forces. The instrumentation becomes increasingly rich. Violins are joined by the lower strings, the woodwind and the four horns enter the fray. The tempo quickens.
Das Tempo nimmt zu.
After this orchestral outburst, the movement closes with the return of the plaintive cor anglais motif. But this time there's no response from the oboe. Instead, the answer comes from the four kettle drums.
This passage requires one player for each kettle drum because the score calls not so much for individual strokes, but for drum rolls, gradually getting louder and then fading away again. The whole passage is designed to evoke a gathering thunderstorm. Outwardly, the movement begins as quietly as it started, but the rural idyll is disturbed, or at least ruffled, by the forces of nature.
Zumindest irritiert.
Berlioz compounds various literary models in his Symphonie Fantastique, as if in a crucible. In his program notes, he reveals the figure that his protagonist is based on. René, the hero of the eponymous novel by François-René Chateaubriand, dating from 1802. Chateaubriand's René is the prototype of the inwardly tormented romantic artist.
René, the hero of Chateaubriand's novel, is a young man entirely wrapped up with himself, who attempts to find literary expression for what is going on in his mind. In other words, a highly introspective character. This was unusual in the 18th century, a time when people defined themselves more in terms of actions and deeds. Feelings and emotions were not so important. Chateaubriand's René was a turning point in that respect. Both in the novel and for Berlioz's alter ego in the symphony, the problem is not so much the passions they are subject to, but rather the state of melancholy induced by their inability to find true fulfillment.
Eine Melancholie, die es aus einer gewissen Unerfülltheit sich herleitet.
In addition, Berlioz identified strongly with Johann Wolfgang von Goethe's Faust, as revealed in a letter to a friend back in 1825.
We will read Hamlet and Faust together. Shakespeare and Goethe, the mute witnesses of my torments. They explain my life.
Im Prinzip kann man sagen,
actually, I believe we can say that the fourth and fifth movements correspond to the cathedral and Walpurgis night scenes in the first part of Goethe's Faust.
In gewisser Weise, und das ist
to some extent at least, it seems impossible to deny that the protagonist in Berlioz's Symphonie Fantastique is a reincarnation of Faust.
In a fit of despair, the artist poisons himself with opium. He dreams that he's killed his beloved, for which he's condemned to death and taken to the scaffold. Finally, the idée fixe reappears like a final remembrance of love, interrupted by the fatal blow.
Basically, this movement is one huge crescendo. It begins softly, gradually gets louder, more dramatic and more exciting, until the execution experienced in the nightmare puts an abrupt end to it all.
The first theme, representing the hollow footfalls of the condemned man, is repeated a number of times until it finally leads to the march theme, expressing the jeers of the watching crowd.
When he puts his head under the guillotine, a sudden silence falls. Then we hear the idée fixe from the oboe. It's the only time it turns up in this movement. Marked pianissimo, dolce assai e appassionato.
The final bars of the fourth movement are graphic in the extreme. A drum roll announces the hero's imminent execution. After the death of the protagonist, the fifth movement of the symphony takes us down into the underworld.
The artist sees himself at a witch's sabbath, in the midst of a hideous assembly of spectres, witches and monsters gathering to celebrate his demise. The beloved melody appears once more, now transformed into a vulgar dance tune, trivial and grotesque.
Down in the underworld, the idée fixe turns up again to indicate that the beloved has ended up here as well. This gives the whole work its structural symmetry. From the first to the fourth movement, the idée had rather receded from view. Its reappearances had become more and more sparse throughout. At the end of the fourth movement, all that's left of it is a short two-bar fragment. In the fifth movement, however, the idée dominates the proceedings, albeit in a stridently distorted and almost unrecognizable mutation.
Den fünften Satz.
This self-quotation is joined by another back reference to one of the oldest musical elements in existence, the Gregorian Dies Irae.
Musikalischen Elemente, nämlich des Dies Irae. Dies Irae heißt
Dies Irae means Day of Wrath, and it's part of the Requiem Mass. The Requiem Mass normally begins with a Kyrie, followed by the Dies Irae section illustrating the distressful features of death.
The Dies Irae leads into the Ronde du Sabbat, a theme that all the preceding sections appear to have been leading up to. Its significance is underlined by a fugato passage. The protagonist's ultimate fate is left undecided. This symphony ends with what Berlioz calls in his program notes a diabolical orgy.
The last movement is an attempt to sum up everything the other four movements have confronted us with and take it all to a final extreme. The clinching character of this finale is more obvious than in almost any other symphony. In Beethoven's Ninth, the finale character is achieved by the addition of singing voices, soloists and chorus. Berlioz chooses a different course. He reassembles all the forces he has mustered previously and screws up the tension even more. Particularly in sonic terms, the effect is overwhelming.
Das ein überwältigender Effekt.
He was extremely extrovert, intent on making sure that the whole world knew exactly how he felt.
Dass alle Welt über seine Seelenzustände Bescheid wusste. Also die Musik drückt eigentlich.
His music constantly expresses what was going on in his mind, and he wanted everyone else to know about it, or ideally, to feel exactly the same way as he did.
So empfinden.
My life is a novel that intrigues me greatly.
What is perhaps the most important chapter of his novel provides the programmatic basis for the Symphonie Fantastique. More than any other of his works, it revolves around his own emotional world. He calls the symphony an episode in the life of an artist. Cert Berlioz, 1830. The 26-year-old composer has just completed his musical studies and already has ambitious plans. He intends to take Paris audiences by storm. But the responses to his music are ambivalent. Some see him as an innovator of genius, others as an iconoclast, only out for effect.
Ich denke, das, was man, ohne dass man Berlioz jetzt...
Without doing Berlioz any injustice, I think we can say...
He was fascinated by the way the English dramatist transcended traditional genre boundaries in his plays.
Berlioz war ein Shakespeare-Maniac, kann man sagen.
In fact, Berlioz was a genuine Shakespeare maniac. His admiration for him knew no bounds, and he transferred that adulation to Harriet Smithson as well. Apparently, she was not exactly the finest actress on the English stage at the time, but in Paris, she caused a sensation.
Zumindest hat sie Sensation gemacht.
Berlioz wanted to impress Harriet Smithson, and he wanted fame. He hoped that the first performance of the Symphonie Fantastique would achieve both these, and announces its inception in a letter to his friend Ferrand.
I'm about to start work on my big symphony, in which I intend to describe the progress of my infernal passion. I have it all mapped out in my head.
The object of Berlioz's infernal passion was a young Irish actress. He had first seen Harriet Smithson in 1827 on stage as Ophelia in a performance of Shakespeare's Hamlet at the Théâtre l'Odéon in Paris. Berlioz was completely bowled over. Like many of his contemporaries, Berlioz was a fervent admirer of Shakespeare.